will kick us off, and then Jennifer will go straight to Jennifer. She's with DCDB and the chair of the IHO Crowdsourced Bathymetry Working Group. But Neil, come on up. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim, for the introduction. I'm just waiting for the slides to get up. Great. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present to you. Working for a startup or co-founded a startup called Aqua-Ocean. I also don't want to give a bit of a commercial presentation on what we're working on, but more focus around some of the design considerations we have for how to enable surveying or marine data collection beyond the open ocean. But to give a context of the company in a very few seconds, essentially we're building hydrogen-powered autonomous vessels. They're about 13 by 8 meters, designed to go 40 days at 4 knots with about 1 kilowatt of power for payload. So, as Duncan was talking about, USVs offer a great opportunity to map the ocean. The challenge is what we can see is that most of the data collected to date has been around the coastal areas. Now, as we move beyond the coastal areas and we try to fill in the really large gaps, we're going to have to look at different design considerations for USVs. Because at the moment, although there are certain solutions that are very capable of deep water ocean surveys, they are very limited. I won't stay on this for too long because Duncan's already talked about it, but essentially current state of the art has been traditional large research vessels, costly, hugely fuel inefficient. However, the chances of us replacing large vessels like this is significantly low. There's only so many capabilities that USVs can actually take. And it'll be, by the time you start adding geotechnical or coring or data, large deployments of CTD costs, it becomes a lot more challenging in the open ocean environment. Alternatives like using other vessels or buoys or satellite data, again, has their limitations, but they all contribute to the entire ocean data collection. So when we look at USVs, what we've seen actually, there was a really interesting paper by Ruth Patterson and her colleagues that was released this year, and it basically did a literature review and search over the term USVs and what are the use cases. Now, of course, this is going to be slightly biased towards research because that's what most papers are written about. But what we see is that although most USVs today are built and designed around coastal operations, the biggest use case around it is actually the unescorted, unsheltered operations, so open ocean. This counts for about 67% of those use cases reported within the literature. The drivers, as again, Duncan's already spoken to, this is really difficult to follow somebody after they've been talking about USVs, but the main drivers here is costs. We want to drive down costs significantly, personnel protection, moving people away from dangerous environments. This can be even more the case when you're working further offshore, especially if you're looking at smaller vessels. And for us, one of the most important one is around the spatial-temporal efficiency. How do we collect more data over more geographic area in a more persistent manner? And this goes beyond just survey. This also goes into marine monitoring protection and data collection, environmental data collection. One of the other key drivers is without people on board and the need to return to port, how can we get endurance? How can we make sure that we're maximizing the amount of time that we're offshore? Because this, again, will feed back into cost, because if we're offshore and not returning back to port, we're actually making more use of the vessel. The report went on to actually highlight some of the key features of an USV, the priority features for USVs. What we see actually is the high priority features are real-time communications. And this is a big challenge when you're working beyond over the horizon, beyond visual line of sight, because you're reliant on satellite technologies, which can be quite expensive, especially if you don't design the vessel to accommodate the latest in technologies. This is also linked to passive perception, which is around your collision avoidance. Where you don't have communication, you need to be more reliant on collision avoidance software. This in its own right has some challenges because of the regulatory landscape that we are seeing, that we actually have to have somebody overseeing a vessel at all times. And then endurance and powerful payload. And these two are kind of linked because as we start to build smaller vessels, what we see is that the amount of power that we require for payload actually starts to get close to the power we need for the smaller vessel. And this, therefore, because we can only take a certain capacity unless you're using solar and wind, you actually are limited by the amount of power you have for your mission and therefore your endurance. So beyond coastal operations. Essentially, when you're working in coastal waters, the significant wave height in most of the areas that we've been mapping to date have actually been relatively small. Most USVs operate in weather conditions of about up to 1.5 meters. That's collecting operational data. That's not all vessels, of course, but most of them are limited by 1.5 meters. But as we get out into the oceans, even during the summer periods, you see that the wave height, the actually average significant wave height, is probably for most of the ocean greater than 2 meters. This is a challenge if you have a vessel that's limited by its operational limits. So current solutions is you need to build a bigger boat. And that is the actual quote. It's not we are the bigger, need a bigger boat. It's you are. The challenge when we build bigger boats, cost. And this was the big driver for USVs in the first place, is we want to drive down cost. But again, looking at the ability to increase operational uptime by building more suitable vessels for offshore. Now, I agree this is not offshore, real open ocean, but it gives a really good example of the benefits you can get. So you've got the Scottish wind farms in the leasing areas. The significant wave height taken from the HSE annual month or the monthly significant wave heights. And pretty much what you see is if you're limited by that 1.5 meters, you're actually getting as little as 65 days of operational time a year. Now, this is not very cost effective if you're trying to maximize the utilization of your asset. As we build bigger, if you could operate in 3 meters, you can get up to 221 days a year. Now, considering that USVs are always built to be as cost effective as possible, just by changing the operational days, you can go from a vessel that was 500,000 to build to something that's maybe 1.5 million and actually still manage to get a same sort of day rate if you're actually depreciating over the same number of years. But with that, you also get an increased capability from the exercise of the vessel. However, there is also further limitations on this. We're still limited to vessels under 24 meters. Well, in most cases, due to the regulations. I mean, certain people like Ocean Infinity, of course, are trying to build larger and larger vessels. This comes with its own challenges. But for the most of us who are working in the small startup space, we're trying to avoid hassles with the regulators and build smaller and keep them under 24 meters. So when we look at monohull, so this is some of the design considerations we came up with when we were designing our vessel. Small monohulls limited to 1.5 meters. When we have a lot of movement in a vessel, we also have a lot of failures and breakages. So we want to reduce that vessel, the accelerations. And we want to prevent ourselves from building too big where the costs go up or we go beyond that 24 meters. So our concept was around the swath vessel. I don't know if many people here know the swath vessels, but they're intrinsically more stable platforms. The vessels themselves have a stability of about 15 times a similar monohull in gross tonnage. So a vessel 20 tons will be equivalent to a vessel about 300 tons. And I think, does this video play? If not, no. No, don't worry about it. It's fine. But anyway, you can find it on YouTube if you Google swath versus monohull. And basically, it shows the difference between a monohull and a swath vessel and the actual increased stability. And that, of course, when you're working with hydrographic data, if we can increase the stability of the platform in rougher seas, we can get better data. The other challenges we start to see when we're going to long endurance USV operations is around how do we power them, especially when you have that high payload power, which you cannot power by something like solar. You move towards generators. Generators have lots of moving parts. They need servicing at every 250 to 500 hours. And this can theoretically limit your endurance. Multiple moving parts is also more failure. So if we look at where the future is going from a clean tech perspective, it's going towards fuel cells, hydrogen-based fuels. And we're always happy to discuss this, but what we've been looking at is some of the benefits that we get from using hydrogen. First of all, visual inspections once a year, probably going to want to do a lot more than that, but that's the standard maintenance procedure. They're very quiet acoustically. So they actually produce less noise, low vibration, so no putting noise into the ocean, affecting your sonars. And what we're also seeing is using electric motors again, so some benefits from the acoustic performance. Additionally, fuel cells have a higher efficiency and therefore emit less heat. Now, anybody who's worked in small USVs and you're dealing with high computer power and large generators knows that managing heat is probably one of the most challenging aspects to come around. With USVs, with hydrogen fuel cells, you're able to reduce the amount of heat and actually manage it more in a more controllable manner, because the heat is maintained within the structure. And then the third challenge here is communications. As I mentioned, operating offshore is very expensive when you're looking at satellite communications. The three main types: Iridium, VSAT or GeoSat, and LeoSat. Now, Iridium is quite low bandwidth. The costs are relatively high, or actually can get very high, depending on your bandwidth. So this small example there, just taken from a couple of websites of what the cost could look like. If you're only transferring 50 kilobytes per second, now just bear in mind that when you're streaming your Netflix at home, you're downloading at about 5 megabytes per second. Now, when you're with Iridium, if you're going at 50 kilobytes a second, over an entire month, based on the monthly contracts, you end up at a cost of around $198 a day. By the time we get up to the maximum that Iridium is doing at the moment, which is around 700 kilobytes per second, you're starting to pay $4,150. It's a big cost difference. The alternative is to move to something like a VSAT or GeoSat. This will help you bring down the costs. And you can see $2,000 a day saving by moving towards VSATs. But this comes at a price. The VSATs are more power intensive, so they need a lot more power. So you can't just power these things by solar. They also have some limitations of where you position them. Most of these domes are around 60 to 70 centimeters at the moment. They need to be positioned away from the radar. So you're looking at 4.6 meters away from a radar and up to 1.2 meters elevation. So you're going to have a bigger mast, means a bigger vessel. So all of these smaller USVs are really going to struggle if they want to go to the VSAT. And what's coming out now is the LeoSat, and that's going to be an absolute game changer when that comes in. So LeoSats, your Starlinks, your OneWebs, that you're talking about 20 megabytes upload speeds, which means that you can get high quality video, but also get some of your data back in near real time. So just some other small design considerations that we took into consideration when coming up with the vessel concept was it needed to be mobilized easily. So modular design, be able to, it's a 13 by 8 meter vessel. It's costly if you want to take it from one location to the other. So can you pull it to pieces? Can we take it to pieces and assemble it on site? Benefit of swath is that we can have a large deck space relative to the amount of volume in the water. And so one of the things we're really passionate about is trying to build towards just swarm operations and distributed maritime operations. So we're currently working on a project that is looking at how do we bring data back to remote operators to allow them to control multiple vessels by minimizing the data burden on each of the operators. And then how do we manage to work with multiple stakeholders? So when we're deploying swarms, we're not just collecting bathymetry, but you can collect a whole range of other oceanographic data. And that's it. So any questions?
Thank you, Neil. I'll see if there's any on Slido. No questions yet. Any questions in the audience? Ken? Or our mic runner went.
Hi, Neil. Ken Childers with TerraDepth. Just wondering what stage of development this system is in right now. Curious, because we've done some work ourselves with hydrogen and PEMs.
So the hydrogen system's gone through Lloyd's Register Approval in Principle. We built out a hydrogen powertrain and tested that through the factory. We have done the design, the simulations of the vessel through its seakeeping analysis. We're now at the point of being a startup, raising funds and trying to get the hull built this year, and then the coming year to start doing demonstrations.
I know. How large is that hydrogen fuel cell?
So we're looking at 9 kilowatt fuel cells because of but then it depends on the power you're requiring for your payload. We run 2 9 kilowatt fuel cells for redundancy, because I think, as you know, redundancy is probably the most critical aspect of a USV. But some of the operations we need to go up to about a 98 kilowatt fuel cell. That's really for interception and acceleration. So if you want to go faster, vessels through the water become very inefficient. So we have to go larger.
But physical size.
Physical size, they are quite large. The entire powertrain with the inverters, we're looking about 600 millimeters by 700 millimeters by about 500 millimeters.
All right, well, thank you, Neil, very much. We're going to move right on to our next speaker, Jennifer Jenks from DCDB.
Okay. Let's see. Thank you all very much. This is much more exciting than giving a presentation into my laptop with only my dog Lucy at my feet to give any sort of real feedback. So I miss this. It's wonderful to be in front of all of you today. So my talk is going to be a little bit different than a lot of these technology presentations that are being presented, in that it's going to focus specifically on the barriers, or a handful of the barriers that have been identified as really standing in the way towards achieving a lot of these goals to map the global gaps. And even more specifically, we're going to talk about, or I'm going to discuss, Crowdsourced Bathymetry Initiative and some of the activities that our working group has been involved with in trying to overcome a lot of these barriers to scaling this work. So as Neil just showed, there's sort of this unwritten rule that you can't present at Map the Gaps without reminding everyone where we are in the global gaps. And these maps are gorgeous to look at, but they're a great reminder, one, of the amazing progress that is being made, but then also it pretty clearly points out the work that we still have ahead of us. And there is no question that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to mapping our ocean floor. And in fact, that's the main reason probably why a lot of us are here this week, is to come to a symposium and to learn about all of the advancements in technology that are being made and where these companies are going in the future. But along with this general understanding that we need this community, as Dr. Jonas spoke earlier, it is also going to take the crowd. It is going to take that common mariner, that we would be almost foolish to not try and leverage the hundreds of thousands, the millions of vessels that are already on the water, many of them with the current capability to actually record depth information. And so back in 2014, the International Hydrographic Organization became very vocal about this and started really trying to develop ways to encourage the contribution of these data that in many cases are actually already even being collected. So they stood up a working group, which there are several of my working group colleagues in the room today. And one of the first things we set about doing was defining what CSV is. So you can't see it with my face there. So crowdsourced bathymetry is the collection and sharing of depth measurements that are being collected from vessels using just their standard navigation instruments undergoing their everyday routine operations. So like most citizen science or crowdsourcing or voluntary initiatives, one of the really big benefits of all of this work is that a lot of the collection and contribution takes place at pretty low, if not no cost to the public sector. In the case of CSB, it's acknowledged that in most cases, the quality, the accuracy of these data certainly cannot rival that of professionally collected data, but it still stands to serve a massive role. It can fill the gaps, and it does fill the gaps where data is very scarce. So if you think of the Arctic or around small island developing states, it's very useful along shallow, complex shorelines. If you think about an area where a hydrographic vessel may rarely, if never, go and visit, but you might have a group of fishermen that are there every single day. There's always colorful conversations about what the role of CSV might be in nautical charts, but it can and has been used in identifying uncharted features and assisting in verifying charted information and in confirming whether charts are appropriate for the latest patterns, traffic patterns. So by 2019, the initiative, we were very excited that we had around 100 vessels that were already, that had begun to participate. Most of them were customers of Rose Point Navigation Systems. This is a North American-based company, which makes sense then that that was where the majority of the data was concentrated around. A few years later, the initiative has really expanded, and now we have 6 companies, organizations that are routinely providing data. I think we're around 250 vessels now around the world that are sending us data on a daily basis. And this is great. This is real growth. But if we take a step back and start really thinking like, okay, how are we going to scale this to the level that we really need to really make an impact in contributing to mapping the gaps? We need to figure out first what's preventing us. And so in our working group, this is a lot of what we've been doing and in discussions with the IHO and with colleagues in the JEPCO community. And we've really come up with 3 key barriers. And of course, that's national policy, technology, and public perception. National policy it's the elephant in the room, but it is the biggest hurdle for being successful in these efforts. And that's because, frankly, most coastal states simply will not allow public access to crowdsourced bathymetry data that's collected within their waters. So over the last 5 or so years, the IHO has sent out 2 letters to IHO member states requesting that they indicate their position on the public sharing of crowdsourced bathymetry that's collected within their waters of national jurisdiction. And to date, we've had 32 coastal states, all of the ones you see there in green, that have replied positively. So what that meant for my shop at the IHO Data Center for Digital Bathymetry, where the data comes to be archived and made publicly available, the IHO asked us to go and stand up a geographic filter that would take into account all of these positions on the distribution of CSB data that's collected in certain countries' waters. And so we did that. We tried to make it as flexible as possible. Some of these data countries do give their blessing for it to go into the JEPCO grid. Some is just a flat out no. And for many of those 32 countries, we are allowed to archive the data and also make it publicly discoverable and accessible. So this is just showing the filter in effect. And so here we're looking at the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, and you can see the track lines of some of the CSB data that's been collected and how that data has been clipped at the EEZs. Now we take a step back and we look at this on a global scale, and you can see that almost half, a little bit less than half, but around half of the data that has come in to the DCDB has had to have been filtered out, and that's everything you see in red. So again, the green shows the positive responses, and the red is not only the nations that have said no, but all the nations, the majority of the nations actually, that haven't responded at all. So we're looking at 20, 30 gigabytes of data, that potentially very useful data that no one can see. So not the public, not hydrographic organizations, not JEPCO. So when we sit back and we try to discuss, okay, how can we make improvements on this? Like in most cases, a lot of it just comes down to education and communication, trying to understand why a lot of these positions are what they are. And so luckily, we have received quite a bit of feedback from many nations, and the IHO has really invested in trying to consolidate and understand these positions. And this is a summary right here that states, it's quite clear from a lot of the responses, that it just remains a general confusion of what CSB is, of where it lies within UNCLOS and law of the sea, and the fact that many coastal states are just interpreting what CSB is quite differently. Add to that these letters that were sent out that many nations just replied with a yes or no answer and didn't take advantage of the fact that you could actually reply yes or no, and then give sort of exceptions or caveats or additional information about what your nation requests. So a big accomplishment we feel that has taken place over the last couple of years is that we have gone out to the 16 IHO regional hydrographic commissions, and we have asked them to provide us a volunteer that could serve as the liaison between the commission and the working group. And so we now have a direct point of contact that can sit on our working group and hear from us and hopefully gain a bit more knowledge about this effort, but can also bring to the table concerns that they have heard directly from their peers within their regions. And so this alone has really helped to clear up a lot of the misperceptions, that exist. Also from these conversations, we've learned that a lot of hesitation in some hydrographic hydrographic offices exist around the notion that this data would be coming into a public database without the offices first being able to review the data. So in-house, what we've been working on, we actually have our developers working on this right now or when they wake up, but is standing up a new application that would allow for a point of contact in a hydrographic office to log in after they've been notified that there's new data that has landed within their areas of jurisdiction, and give them the chance to actually go through that data and approve what data can be made publicly available and what still needs to be embargoed. We're hoping that just when this also officially gets deployed, that this will encourage a lot of the countries that are currently sitting on the fence to perhaps reply positively and join the effort. Then, of course, technology always plays a big piece here. If we really do want to scale this to a crowd, if we really do want to take advantage of the hundreds of thousands, maybe more, of potentially interested mariners out there, we need to make it as easy as possible for them to participate. And so we have an extremely active, probably many of you in this room know Dr. Brian Calder, very active on the CSB working group. And from the beginning, he's been posing this question to all of us. What is that minimum cost, minimal functionality data collection system for CSB? And Brian, being Brian, has gone about trying to answer that question. And so he has stood up, and there are others in the community that are working to do the same and working with Brian. But Brian and his colleagues have stood up what's referred to as the WIBBLE. You can't beat a name like that. But this is the wireless inexpensive bathymetry logger. It's more than just that piece of hardware. I mean, it is the inexpensive open source data logger, wonderful, but it's more than that. It is a full spectrum solution from the hardware all the way to the cloud. It is a system that includes everything you need for processing the data, for formatting that data, so it's set up in a way for us to receive it at the DCDB, and it automatically transmit that data to us. The biggest takeaway here is that every single thing that you see on this slide is open source. And so by removing the central authority, there is no limitation on how this could scale. It's not just the collecting and contribution of data, it's also how do we make finding the data, accessing the data, and using the data easier. And that again comes back to our shop at the DCDB. For years, we've traditionally just offered up all of our bathymetric data, just flat files. The way it comes in is the way we serve it all to you. But we have been investing in trying to provide different options of starting with our CSV data, of creating a cloud hosted scalable point store. It allows so much better handling and scaling of these data and offers it to all of you as a seamless collection of points. So now the community can go and grab the data that way, or they can also begin creating bathymetric grids of any sort of given area with your specified resolution. So again, just trying to provide additional options to help give the community, meet their needs. Finally, there's public perception. It isn't just the governments that are raising an eyebrow at CSB, but it is all of the community that's saying, okay, why? What's in it for me? Why should I be participating in this? So we hear this all the time. We have in our working group representatives from so many various sectors, and we have, I believe, Everett is one that brought this one from folks in the fishing communities in Norway. A lot of them have no interest. Why would they at all risk sharing the location of maybe their favorite fishing hole to others? Why would a surveyor in the oil and gas industry who's thinking my job is to actually go out and do high resolution surveying? This is obviously mutually exclusive from the CSB effort. Universities, not all are looking to take on yet another potentially expensive research effort. Cruise line industry we go to, a lot of them think that if they were to start collecting data, that it wouldn't be useful. Their routes are pre-planned, they're repetitive. Who would actually want this? Are we stepping on toes of other navigational software companies who absolutely have no interest of perhaps having their business model affected? And then we have heard from those in the super yacht community that there are a lot of folks out there that have zero desire to have their location and their whereabouts known. So these are the kind of questions that we're fielding day in, day out. And we know that no one has the bandwidth to actually sit with each and every one and to have these conversations and to try to answer all of their concerns. But we're trying, and we do have an extremely diverse working group who can sit there and we can work together, and we have put together all sorts of tailored materials to the communities listed here. We have a whole list of communities we want to start addressing in the upcoming year to at least begin to start understanding what their concerns are, figuring out on our end how to encourage their participation. So again, this is where we are today. The CSB program does continue to grow, but we have a long ways to go. And the obstacles that I did just very briefly cover, they're real, they're not insignificant, but each and every one can certainly be overcome. And I've been using this quote for years because I love it so much. This is from a former member of our working group who crunched the numbers and calculated that if we could get only 1% of all seagoing vessels to log data, and you figure on average they spend about half their time at sea, we could be looking at 5 billion data points a day. And so if we really could scale CSB in the way that the potential is there for it to do, this could stand to make a massive contribution to mapping the gaps of our seafloor. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer and Neil, for your talks today. Looks like we've got, we're a little behind schedule, so we're just going to take a couple questions. 2 questions. First one is, I saw Sweden as green on your chart showing the countries allowing CSB. It is only allowed to collect it in the EEZ, not territorial waters.
So that is correct. So the letters that were sent from the IHO ask a very specific set of questions tailored to every maritime zone. So that's correct. So if we were to have zoomed in, there would not be data in the territorial sea of Sweden.
Okay. Another question. Some countries were red. That was a surprise. UK, Australia, question mark.
So Australia, I'll speak to, and that Australia in June actually just submitted a reply to the letter, a positive reply. The filter on the red and green map still shows them as red because we have not worked out the details of the filter yet. So that is more of just a communication.
Okay.
So, and as for the other countries, that's correct. We are still hopeful to be hearing positive replies from many of them.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer. All right. Well, We're going to take a break now. The agenda says coffee and crumpets. I don't actually know if there's crumpets, but it seemed appropriate to call them crumpets anyway. But there's coffee and something back there. We're going to get going. I'm sorry we're compressed on time, but we're going to get going right again at 11 o'clock because we do have people online. I was just checking out YouTube, the live stream while Jennifer was talking. We had several dozen people online watching. So it's working. That's cool. It's great to know that it's working, plus the thousands of people here in the room. So enjoy the coffee and crumpets. We'll start right again at 11 o'clock with our panel on communications in oceans.